Our next speaker is Professor Maire Connolly from NUI Galway. I suppose we're continuing on an Atlantic journey that started this evening in Donegal with our minister and went down to Clare with Tracy, and we're back up to Galway with Maire. Maire comes from the Centre for One Health in NUI Galway, where she is Professor of Global Health and Development. She graduated in medicine from NUIG, holds a Master's in Public Health from UCD, and a diploma in Tropical Medicine from the School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. Her areas of expertise include health security, disease surveillance, emerging infectious diseases, pandemic preparedness, and humanitarian emergencies. Prior to joining NUI Galway, Maire worked at WHO HQ in Geneva for 15 years as Coordinator for Disease Control in Emergencies and subsequently advisor to WHO Assistant Director General for Health Security up until 2012. Her role included setting the global research agenda for emergencies. She has over 50 WHO technical reports and peer-reviewed publications and has published 3 books on communicable diseases and emergencies. She's currently on one of the advisory groups advising NEFIT on the national response to COVID. So with that, I'm handing over to Maire, who's going to speak on the crossover between birds and man in the context of avian influenza. As you may be aware, there have been a number of outbreaks of avian influenza in Europe, and we've had 3 positive cases so far here in the Republic of Ireland in wildlife. So over to you, Maire. Thank you.
Thank you, Damien, and it's a pleasure to be here this evening to speak to you on the issue of protecting animal and human health. And I'm going to be looking at the specific example of avian influenza as a very important disease that, as Tracy said, you guys are the front line. Farmers are our frontline workers. You guys are the most important alert mechanisms to let us know where we are going in the future in terms of zoonosis. So I'm going to briefly look at the history of pandemics, specifically talking about the influenza pandemics of the last 100 years. I'm going to look at the risks posed by animal diseases or zoonosis to humans. I'm going to look, as Damien mentioned there have been a number of cases of H5N8 in wild birds across Europe, which is not unusual for this time of the year. And I'm going to speak then about biosecurity measures to protect poultry, which is particularly important as we move into the winter with the circulating strain of H5N8. And then I'm at the very end going to briefly talk about One Health, which ties it back to what Tracy spoke about, the importance of a holistic approach to the health of animals and humans. So in terms of an epidemic, we use a number of different definitions, but essentially it's the widespread occurrence of an infectious disease in a population at a particular time. And this can obviously relate to humans or to animals. And a pandemic, very simply put, is a lot of cases in a lot of places. And I think we all understand now clearly what a pandemic can lead to in terms of disruption of our lives and health. So if you look back to 1918, probably the biggest pandemic in terms of the impact on the health of populations occurred between 1918 and 1919. And it's estimated that there were over 15 million deaths. And this disease was quite scary because it affected young adult males, many of them who were returning from World War I. It originated from domestic and wild birds. And what you can see here is the transmission across the US over a period of 6 weeks. And this at a time when there was no air travel. This was primarily by rail. So even at a time of relatively low infrastructure for travel, this virus managed to rapidly get across the US and globally. The life expectancy in the US led to there was a massive drop in it because of the 1918 flu epidemic. Again, a lot of this was due to its impact, the mortality rates in young males particularly. So since the 1918 Spanish flu pandemic, we've had 3 influenza pandemics. In 1957, the Asian flu, and in '68, the Hong Kong flu. Both leading to about 1 to 4 million deaths. And then you'll all remember 2009 swine flu, which was H1N1, originated in Mexico, and that's estimated to have led to about 284,000 deaths. It was a much milder disease than previous influenza pandemics, and a vaccine was delivered in record time. But I think after that pandemic, there was a certain sense of complacency that, you know, pandemics don't really cause disruption like we thought they would. But I think COVID has shown us that it's a wake-up call. We cannot be complacent in terms of the threats posed by animals to human health. So in terms of the risks for disease emergence here in 2020, and I don't think this lecture was more difficult 2 or 3 years ago, where I would have been, during my time in WHO, going around shroud waving, saying you must invest in early warning systems for animal disease, you must invest in good laboratory systems, good public health infrastructure. But what we're seeing is an increasing growth in the risk of emerging diseases. This is to do with human populations growing in numbers and expanding into new geographic areas. Deforestation, for example, changes in land use with greater logging. This was one of the main causes to the Ebola outbreak, which occurred in West Africa in 2013. Increased contact with wild and domestic animals due to this human encroachment, and intensive farming practices. Also, as the Minister mentioned in his opening address, we are dealing with the widespread use of antimicrobials and the challenge of antimicrobial drug resistance. International trade and travel leads to greater movement of people, animals, and animal products, so it's much more difficult to track the travel of potential infected products. And finally, in summary, this increased risk of diseases, this leads to an increased risk of diseases that can spread between animals and people, the term that we call zoonotic diseases. And the reality is that of the emerging diseases that have affected man in the last 30 years, 75% of them have originated in animals, and the majority of them in wild animals. And this shows an overview of the outbreaks of emerging diseases and re-emerging diseases in human populations that were reported to WHO over the past 25 years. And you'll see a number of familiar diseases there and diseases that you'll be aware of through working with animal populations. And COVID is now a new disease that's been added to that as another virus which has emerged from horseshoe bats in China. So avian influenza, or bird flu as it's more commonly known. What is it? So it's primarily a bird disease, but the virus can mutate and can affect other animals and humans. It mainly infects poultry and wild birds, and domestic chickens and turkeys are particularly susceptible. It's fatal in most infected birds, and aquatic fowls such as ducks may have greater resistance to the disease, and they can act as a reservoir to allow the disease to travel. And what we're seeing in the most recent outbreak coming from Europe is that migratory birds are traveling westwards and bringing the disease with them. So avian influenza is divided into two groups, and you'll all be familiar with the term that Tracy mentioned, highly pathogenic avian influenza. This spreads rapidly throughout a flock, causing serious disease and with very high mortality rates in many cases. It can be up to 100% in 1 to 2 days. There's also a low pathogenic avian influenza strain which causes a mild disease, and this may go undetected. And the concern from a human perspective is that avian influenza can lead to epidemics or pandemics of human influenza. The origin and distribution of flu variants, the vast majority have come from Southeast Asia, and we were very closely monitoring the situation with H5N1. And H1N1 emerging in Mexico was a complete sidewinder. We were not thinking that the next pandemic strain of influenza would come from swine in Mexico or California. So we do have to remain vigilant. We don't know where the next strain is coming from. The reason why Southeast Asia is such a hotbed of emergence of new flu variants is a lot to do with our animal husbandry practices. The fact that humans tend to live very closely with their animals, and they tend to perhaps not have as stringent biosecurity measures as we would have in Europe, for example. And the whole thing with the problem with COVID and the horseshoe bats is that it's thought that the intermediate host of the pangolin, which is used for, it's a medicinal product used for Chinese medicine, that this is how it got introduced into the human population. And again, it's one spillover event that has led to such disruption of our lives over the past 9-10 months. So influenza A in humans, we all know what this is. So seasonal human influenza occurs every year in the winter months. There's a vaccine that's available for it, and it's changed every year based on the circulating strains in Australia and the Southern Hemisphere the previous winter. Every year it changes every year, so that's why a new vaccine is needed, and these are usually minor changes in the virus. The mortality for seasonal human influenza is usually in older people. And then we have pandemic influenza, and we've had 4 of these in the past 100 years. This is where a novel or a brand new influenza virus emerges, and there's been major change to the virus structure. And this just shows you part of the reason why it changes is when there's reassortment between species. So you've got human strain of influenza A with a bird strain of influenza A affecting a pig, and then you get the viruses changing and swapping genetic material, and you come out with a brand new strain that there's no immunological memory in humans for. So the prerequisites of a pandemic: firstly, a novel influenza virus must emerge to which there is little or no immunity among the population. Secondly, it must be able to replicate in humans, and that's the critical step, the spillover into humans. And farmers are often the first line of infection, or those involved in slaughtering animals. And then the third step, which is often the most difficult one, it must be able to efficiently transmit from one human to another, causing global spread of disease. And this is what we saw with COVID-19. We knew when healthcare workers were getting infected in Wuhan in January that there was human-to-human transmission. So why does influenza pose a pandemic threat to humans? And this is a slide that I've been using for medical students and nursing students for the last number of years. And in this slide, we compare influenza with SARS-1. And SARS-1, as you may remember, was a disease that emerged in Guangdong in China around the same time, end of November, early December in 2002. It subsequently went on to infect about 8,000 people and caused about 800 deaths. The reason why SARS was controlled is because once you get infected with SARS and you become sick, you don't become infectious until a week later. So there was a whole week that public health measures could be implemented stringently. The challenge that we have with influenza and with COVID-19, and one of the reasons why it is spread so efficiently across the globe, is that people can be infectious with SARS-2 and influenza for 1 to 2 days before they actually become sick. And you'll be familiar with that concept dealing with animals, that animals can have transmitted the virus across the flock before any of them are sick. So this is an important feature of SARS-2 and influenza, and why it is so important to have early detection to make sure that any possible sources of an infection are rapidly controlled. So I'm going to look at 2 examples of influenza A that pose a particular threat to humans. H5N1 was first detected in '96 in geese in China, and it didn't seem to cause any trouble. People were keeping an eye on it, and we were monitoring it from Geneva, WHO. However, there was a big outbreak in birds in Hong Kong in 1997. Margaret Chan was the then Director of Health. She subsequently became the Director General of WHO, and she ordered the culling of 1.5 million chickens in Hong Kong. H5N1 went on then to spread globally, killing millions of poultry in Asia, North Africa, and the Middle East. The total number of humans infected since 1997 is relatively low. It's of the order of 800 plus cases. But what's a real concern is the high case fatality. So over half the people who got infected with H5N1, humans who got infected, died. And many of these were working with animals, either vets or farmers, poultry farmers, working directly with these animals. The last documented H5N1 human infection was in February 2019. But despite that, we still have it on the radar in terms of a disease that could potentially pose a pandemic threat. So H5N1, it's a fast mutating, highly pathogenic virus. It's found in multiple bird species, which makes it difficult to control. And there was unprecedented global spread in 2007 and 2008. And you can see there on the right is a picture of a heat sensor that was used in Hong Kong to try and pick up potential human cases. And on the left-hand side is part of the culling of 1.5 million birds, which took place in 1997 in Hong Kong. So the bird flu and the danger to humans, it's again, I mentioned H5N1 in humans are infected by close contact with live infected poultry. The birds carry the virus excreted in feces, and when it dries, it becomes pulverized and then can be inhaled or taken in by touch. And humans have no immunity against this virus. The symptoms of bird flu or H5N1 in humans are similar to common influenza, but it tends to deteriorate quite rapidly with pneumonia and acute respiratory distress syndrome in over 50, in a high proportion of people, with death rates, as I mentioned, of over 50%. The second virus that we are monitoring very carefully is H7N9. And these are just names for the different type of viruses and the protein structures, so we can actually identify the different strains. This bird flu virus emerged in China in 2013. Over the following 5 years, there have been over 1,500 humans, with a case fatality rate slightly lower than H5N1 of about 40%. There was a reduction to 750 cases in 2017. Again, they all tend to occur around the winter season, and 3 cases in 2018. There were no cases last year, 2019. China instituted vaccination of chickens against this disease in 2017. But WHO has identified this particular strain, H7N9, as an unusually dangerous pathogen for humans. And CDC has also estimated that this virus has the greatest potential to cause a pandemic. So where are we now today in terms of H5N8? Again, a different strain of the virus. This poses a lower risk to humans. It's less able to infect humans. So the first confirmed case of highly pathogenic avian influenza, H5N8, was confirmed in a peregrine falcon in Limerick on the 6th of November. There were 2 further wild bird cases confirmed in a mute swan in Monaghan and a curlew in Mayo on the 18th of November. These tests were conducted by the Central Veterinary Research Lab, which is part of the Department of Agriculture's Wild Bird Avian Influenza Surveillance System, which is a really important mechanism in place to provide early warning for us. This follows on from a number of outbreaks in poultry farms and wild birds in England and on mainland Europe. There have been outbreaks in 2 poultry flocks in England and in wild birds in England. And there have been outbreaks confirmed in poultry in the Netherlands, Germany, Denmark, France, and Sweden. And it's also been isolated and detected in a large number of wild birds throughout Europe. And my understanding has been over 79 confirmed cases since Friday around Europe. No further notifications in Ireland since the 3 cases in the wild birds. And as I mentioned, fortunately, this particular strain poses a relatively low risk of infection to human, but there's never no risk, and that virus can still mutate. And this just shows you the location of the avian influenza outbreaks of H5N8 in poultry and wild birds, over the past 3 weeks, and this has been constantly updated on a daily basis. So the risk to Ireland from the current avian influenza strain: this disease is highly contagious for birds. The risk has increased to Irish poultry flocks due to the transmission in Europe. Strict biosecurity measures are needed to prevent the introduction of this strain of influenza into poultry and captive bird flocks. Flock owners should remain vigilant for any signs of disease and report any disease suspicion to their nearest veterinary office. As Tracy said, if you see something, say it. And clearly what's very important is that members of the public do not handle sick or dead wild birds. So what can poultry owners do to reduce the risk of this strain of avian influenza? Firstly, to monitor your birds carefully for any clinical signs of disease, and this includes death or high mortalities in a flock, depression or lethargy among the birds, loss of appetite, respiratory distress, blue discoloration of combs, wattles, neck and throat, diarrhea, reduced egg production or no egg production. The biosecurity measures that are crucial: wear disposable or dedicated outdoor clothing when dealing with your birds. Wear boots that can be disinfected, disposable gloves, and wash hands after contact with birds. As I mentioned, monitoring the birds is important. Cleaning and disinfecting hard surfaces such as paths, also equipment that can come into contact with the birds. Two other points that are really important is to minimize the access to the flocks by wild birds, and to feed and water birds inside or under cover, because you don't want wild birds feeding around your farm and introducing the virus to your flocks. Prevention in poultry: the measures to prevent and control avian influenza is coordinated at the EU level. There are import bans to reduce the risk of poultry being introduced, and the purpose is to prevent potential spread to domestic poultry. There's a prohibition on importation of live poultry, and that protects our health status. And being an island, we have had a lower incidence of many animal diseases that are present in other countries due to our island status. In terms of prevention of human infection, transmission to humans can occur, but it is rare. Almost all cases in humans to date, particularly those in China and Hong Kong, have been linked to close contact with diseased household flocks. People who are involved in slaughtering, defeathering, butchering, and preparation of poultry consumption are at high risk for transmission from poultry to humans. Use of PPE if flocks become sick is essential to reduce the risk of transmission to farmers. And biosecurity measures such as safe culling and disposal of carcasses is important to avoid introduction into humans. So in summary, the future threats: COVID has shown us the vulnerability of human populations to infectious diseases of animal origins. As the Minister mentioned, this COVID pandemic has had major economic and social consequences in addition to health consequences. These diseases will continue to emerge and re-emerge because of the adaptation of microbes and because of human behaviour, trade, travel and technology. And these diseases, these zoonoses, these animal diseases pose a major threat to animal health, human health, economies and security in an increasingly interconnected world. In summary, H5N1 swine flu was relatively mild. We're on a very positive stage of the development of this pandemic with great successes on the vaccine development side for COVID-19, but we don't know what's around the corner. Early warning animal health surveillance systems are crucial to detect new circulating strains of avian influenza, and we've shown over the last 2 weeks how effective that system is across Europe to ensure we know where we are in terms of cases of this new strain. Close collaboration between animal and human disease and biosecurity systems is essential to promptly detect and control potential future threats. All countries, and that's globally, need the capacity to conduct rapid culling of affected flocks. And the One Health initiative, as outlined by Tracy, needs to form the core of policy at local, national, EU and global levels. And I'd just like to close on this slide on One Health. The Minister mentioned One Health as a framework that recognises that the health of people is connected to the health of animals and our shared environment. It's a collaborative, multi-sectoral and interdisciplinary approach, working at local, regional, national and global levels with the ultimate goal of achieving health outcomes, good health outcomes for humans and animals. And this joint approach is absolutely crucial to protect human, animal and planetary health in the future. And I think what would be great to see is that farmers, as a very powerful group, take this forward from the front line and spearhead this drive to try and have a holistic One Health approach to animal, human and environmental health. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you very much, Maire, for a very interesting talk. I suppose Maire reiterated there the point that 75% of emerging diseases are zoonosis. I think she did it. She explained to us in very straightforward terms what spillover events are and their significance to the human population. And I suppose it is reassuring to note that the current strain of avian influenza is of relative low risk to humans, but as she says, there's no such thing as no risk. And I think a key element here is that an early warning surveillance system for animal health is also important for human health in the context of avian influenza. So thanks very much, Maire. That was a very interesting talk.